Welcome to American Education FM, everybody. I'm Dr. Sean Brooks.
Well, welcome back. Here we go. Okay, this was an episode I've been looking forward to for quite some time. It was something, of course, that I was thinking about and have been thinking about, frankly, for a number of years. Probably dating back even to graduate school when I was learning about the origins of much of these words and how we've been deceived throughout our entire lives, and certainly throughout American K-12 school and university settings, and just in basic culture, and certainly throughout the media. And turning on the old idiot box and listening to the idiots on the idiot box use these words with regularity without their real context. And then Jesse James hit me up and he said, "Hey man, I'd love to have you on the show, and we can go through the history of a lot of these words if you're interested. So do a dig on it and then come on the show." And I said, "Sure, no problem." And then Donald Trump got shot at, and so I was on his show anyway. But we of course changed the entire topic of the show, and rightfully so. But either way, I asked him if I could do this particular episode just on my own, and he said, "Go for it, 100%." So here we go, a little special episode specifically dedicated to just this. And again, I have a list of words here that I want to run through, and you've heard these words your whole life. And certainly, you've heard these words be used in numerous contexts by basically both sides of the so-called political aisle. And you wouldn't think that you would, because if these words are so divisive, why is it that everybody is using them in the same context, so they think? And using them to represent themselves when they're apparently supposed to be on opposite sides of things. So before I get into the actual list and the history of all of this, and I have a great deal to read regarding this, first of all, I'm losing my voice again. So I've recorded these two last episodes here back to back. If it completely shoots out on me throughout this, I'll just keep mumbling my way through. But I want people to understand that with the use of these words, you need to understand that when a word is created out of nothing, and it's grabbed out of thin air, you always have to examine the individual who created the word, what their motives for doing so were, and how taking a word and its motive and its made-up meaning, because if the word is made up, so is the meaning. What is it being directed toward? And whom is it being directed toward? And all of that matters, because that's the motive, usually in most of these cases. It's used to become ubiquitous within a vernacular among society, regardless of the location of where a person lives. But of course, because we sort of live in a global world, as much as some of us don't want to, words that originated in one particular geographic area have certainly made its way in basically every other geographic area. And you'll hear them be used consistently in multiple platforms by multiple different kinds of people. So you have to keep that in mind. And then you have to keep in mind that the sin of psychology and the fraudulent nature and the rationalization of that sin is also a part of the misuse of these words and the perversion of these words, even if some of these words were created and certainly based on their origin to be factually accurate and be useful for a good reason. So keep in mind again that the removal of these words, the adoption of these words, all of that has a motive, and that motive is not always good. But again, it's the origin of these words that people do not look up, and it is the individuals who began to use them and spread them around, and then, of course, adopt them and make them mainstream. You have to ask yourself the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And there's no better subject than to do that than it is with words. So my recommendation is that you take this particular episode and sort of set it aside. And then if you want to educate someone on the words that they hear in society and that you may use yourself, that hopefully you either stop using them or that you use the correct terminology and understand the difference between fake made-up words and real words that are, of course, being weaponized against all of us all of the time. And as you would expect, As it turns out, it is the Jewish lobby that manipulates a great deal of these words and has been in control of creating some of these words and then perversing their definitions over the course of time, or, like I said a second ago, just creating them out of thin air and then using their made-up definitions to be weaponized to protect themselves at the expense of everyone else who doubts anything that they do and or say. So with that said, here we go. Excuse me. The first word, democracy. This, of course, is a word that is being used by both the proverbial left and the right, politically speaking. They consistently say this is a threat to our democracy, a threat to our democracy. And then, of course, that very famous clip that's mashed up of all the local news affiliates back in 2020 saying this is a threat to our democracy. In fact, it was even before 2020, if I'm not mistaken. We may all remember that. It says here that the word democracy comes from the Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. So democracy can be thought of as power of the people, a way of governing which depends on the will of the people. Here's the problem. Democracy, more specifically, has to do with the majority. That majority rules no matter what. So there is a difference between a democracy and a constitutional republic. We, of course, live in a constitutional republic. A constitutional republic is a republic made up of representatives of the people, chosen by the people for the people, to represent the Constitution. The term democracy has nothing to do with the Constitution, and you will never hear the term nor read the term democracy in any of the founding documents of our country. In fact, many of the founding fathers detested democracy and openly spoke and wrote about warning about democracy, where the majority rules and then the majority gets to rule over the other people no matter what. And see, this is again why this word is being perversed by both the left and the right. But also the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers of the time also warned about democracy as well. That if you have individuals who are in a position of even perceived power or perceived majority, that is also referred to as, in their own heads, a democracy, which is not what we live in. Now, as far as the delusional are concerned, they think that we live in a democracy where the majority rules. And as we know, also, just from human behavior, the louder a person gets, the more that they think or believe that they are right. And that if you don't go along with what they say, then there's something wrong with you, because the majority rules. So what you're seeing now in today, based on the actual origin of the term democracy, is you're seeing individuals within workplaces, for example, i.e. the education business, that if you're in the minority in a wavelength of thought, in particular in the political landscape that we live in, then you are the subject of all that democracy has to offer, which is, of course, you being bullied in the workplace, you lose your job, you're singled out, you're isolated, et cetera, all of that. So there's key takeaways here regarding both a democracy and a republic. First of all, a pure democracy is power that's held by the population as a whole, whereas in a republic, the power is held by the individual citizens. So I'm bouncing back and forth here between what a democracy is and what a republic is. Again, Plato's book was called Republic for a reason. Making laws. When it comes to making laws, in a democracy, a voting majority has almost unlimited power to make laws. Minorities have few protections from the will of the majority. Whereas in a republic, the people elect representatives to make laws according to the constraints of the Constitution. This is why we have a constitution in the first place, is to counter a democracy. That was the point. That's why they created it. They created it to be the opposite of English rule by the King of England at the time. In a democracy, it is ruled by the majority, whereas in a republic, the laws are made by elected representatives of the people. Regarding the protection of rights in a democracy, rights can be overridden by the will of the majority. Let that sink in. Whereas in a republic, your protection of rights is a constitutional protection, and it protects the rights of all the people from the will of the majority. Again, I hope you're thinking about what's happened over the last 4 years from 2020 to 2024. Look what's happened. The majority has ruled. The corporations have ruled. Your bosses have ruled. What they say went. What they say was the way that it was. Laws were ignored. Your rights were ignored, which means a constitutional republic was ignored and a democracy took over. Earliest examples of this were Athenian democracy in Greece in 500 BCE, and then in a republic, the earliest example of a republic was the Roman Republic in 509 BCE. Again, very different ways of governing, very different ways of running a country and operating as a people. People have the power. People have the say. That's the way that it's supposed to be in a republic. So when you hear people reference democracy or this is a threat to our democracy, again, I even heard Donald Trump bring this up, and I'm being objective here. I even heard him say, regarding being shot in the ear apparently, that he took a bullet for democracy. That was a direct quote from him. I actually took a bullet for democracy. So I'm not trying to destroy democracy. I took a bullet for democracy. As it turns out, he took a bullet from democracy because he's supposed to be representative of a republic, of a constitutional republic, not a democracy. The democracy wanted to rule over him by killing him, thereby ruling over us. This is where the manipulation of these words begins, and it starts to take over, of course, in modern times. That's just one of many examples. Let me give you some more here again regarding the difference between a democracy and a republic, because it is a constitutional republic that we are supposed to live in, not a democracy. In fact, the word democracy should only be brought up in the negative in our country by our citizens and or politicians, because it literally means a dictatorship, that an individual or group of individuals rule over the people, portraying themselves as being the majority when in fact they may not be. Now, don't think of 1930s Germany. Don't do that yet. Hopefully you're not saying to yourself, well, that's like Hitler. No, it wasn't. I'll get into the history of that in a minute in this episode, I promise. Just stick around and listen for it. First of all, constraints on the government regarding a democracy. There are none. The majority can impose its will on the minority anytime it wants. That's a democracy. That's frightening. Whereas in a republic, there are constraints. The majority cannot take away certain inalienable rights. Thank God for the founding fathers and the Constitution. That was the whole point. That's why you don't see the word democracy in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, or the Bill of Rights. Definition of a democracy, again, is ruled by the omnipotent majority. In a democracy, an individual and any group of individuals composing any minority have no protection against the unlimited power of the majority. It is a case of majority over man, whereas in a republic, a constitutionally limited government of the representative type, created by a written constitution, i.e. the U.S. Constitution, adopted by the people and changeable by them only by its amendment, with its powers divided between 3 separate branches of government. Now, which one of those are we supposed to live in? A republic. This is why The Democrat Party calls themselves Democrats because they want a democracy. Same word, demo, demoned, if you want to put it that way, but it means control. And then at the exact same time, you have individuals who are now, of course, referring to the Democrat Party as the Democratic Party. This is part of the word manipulation also that has happened in the last 10 years, that they all got on the same page because they all got the same memo. We need to start calling it the Democratic Party because we want to be democratic, which means we want to lean toward and act on a democracy, not a republic. That's why they call them Republicans, because they're supposed to represent a republic, a constitutional republic. Now, what we know is neither side does, do they? This is where you get, of course, the infiltration of the Jewish lobby into both wings on this eagle, and then it controls the masses through manipulation and word usage. Again, its history originated regarding democracy in classic Athens, and the republic in classic Rome. Sovereignty is held by, in a democracy, the whole population as a group. Everybody together, no matter what. That depends, though, doesn't it? If everybody's evil, well, then that's not good. And they're crushing on the people who don't agree with them. Whereas in a republic, it's the individual who has the sovereignty. You have it. I have it. And that's enough. It protects me as a God-created human being individual. This, of course, is the problem with our society and the world today, is they don't like individuality. They like herd mentality among the group. They've gotten people away from thinking like an individual person. They don't like individuality. That's because they don't like a republic. Again, famous examples, classical Greece and Rome regarding a democracy, and they were fighting the republic also, but the classic example of the republic is also the United States and its origin as well. Common confusion in the United States regarding a democracy. Quote, people commonly confuse direct democracy with representative democracy. The U.S. officially has a representative style, though many have suggested the U.S. is closer to an oligarchy or a plutocracy. Whereas in a republic, the common confusion in the United States is that the United States is actually a republic, and it says the U.S. is actually a republic. It is governed by rule of law. The elected is supposed to be bound by oath to the written governing limits, i.e. Constitution, yet vote together, quote unquote, and create laws to address concerns of the represented in a democratic way, unquote. So I bring these two terms up very purposefully at the top here. It's a political season. Everybody knows that. But listen to the number of people that use the term democracy and who they are and where they are, and how often you hear the term constitutional republic. You hear a constitutional republic hardly ever these days, as opposed to the term democracy or democratic, or whatever other version of that word that they want you to be ingrained with. Not an accident. We live in a constitutional republic, not a democracy. We never want to live in a democracy. And like I said earlier in conclusion, this right here is one of the largest problems because it's even the perception of a democracy that those who are quote unquote democratic want you to believe exists. That if they have the stage, if they have the microphone, and they say it's a thing, then it must be a thing. And as it turns out, that's not true. That you have to wear the mask because we say so. Look around, everybody's doing it. Therefore, you have to do it. You don't have a choice. You have to take the shots because you don't have a choice. Wrong. We live in a republic. I have the choice. I'm the individual with the rights, not you. I get to say what goes, not you. And the Constitution of the United States of America trumps any employee contract, no matter what. Inalienable rights. They cannot be invaded or leaned against you and used against you unlawfully. This again is why we are at war, because the very foundation and the word usage that created our country is being used against us. That should prove to people that we are at war. Okay, the next term, racist. This is commonly attributed to Leon Trotsky as being the one who perpetuated this term and created it. As it turns out, that's not true. In fact, I'm going to read the false history of this word first, and then I'm going to bring in the accurate history and where this came from. This also to keep in mind of what I said at the very top of this particular episode, is that this is where the psychological manipulation of these words and the motives and the kinds of people take these words and twist them. And then they use them to their advantage, because if they say them often enough, then it must be real. If their definition is used often enough, then it must be real. And that's not true. So here's kind of the fake history of the term racist. It, of course, comes from the word race, which I'll get to here in a minute, which is accurate. But this is the inaccurate history of this, again, being attributed to Leon Trotsky, which is not true. It says, although Leon Trotsky was a murderer and a horrible person, that should go without saying. But either way, moving on. It says, according to the second edition of 1989 of the Old English Dictionary, the earliest known usage of the term racism, ISM, in English occurred in a 1936 book by the American fascist, quote-unquote, I'll get to that word later, Lawrence Dennis, in The Coming American Fascism. The second usage of the term in English in the Old English Dictionary records is in the title of the book originally written in German in 1933 and in 1934, but translated into English and first published in 1938. Racism by Magnus Hirschfeld, translated by Eden and Cedar Paul. Since Hirschfeld died in 1935 before the publication of Dennis's book the following year and had already used the word extensively in the text and title of his own book, it seems only fair to recognize him rather than Dennis as the originator of the word racism. In the case of the word racist as an adjective, the Old English Dictionary ascribes the first known usage to Hirschfeld himself. Now, what's the commonality between those names of those individuals that I just mentioned? They happen to be Jewish, and they happen to be communists. This is going to be a theme. The term communism was created by Jews. I'll get to the word communism later, but this is where the word manipulation exists. This word manipulation has existed throughout time, typically by those who ascribe the communist philosophies, much like the word democracy. Majority rules. What we say goes. You don't have a say nor individual rights. A commune. A commonality. Now the term race, this is again the accurate history of this. George Louis Leclerc, or Comte de Buffon, was an 18th century French nationalist and aristocrat. He's often credited with introducing the term race, quote unquote, and developed a theory of human racial origins approximately 100 years before Darwin. Now, Darwin was a fraud, but that's another story for another time. And it says, unlike many of his contemporaries, Leclerc did not believe that each race was a separate species, but used the term as a means of distinguishing people of different skin colors and physical features. Now, it can be argued that different races are a different species of human, so to speak. This has been widely accepted and widely studied in numerous academic articles and academic research from an anthropological standpoint. With that said and all of that aside, Leclerc brought this specifically up having to do with Southern French moving their way into middle and northern France. So in the country of France by itself, Southern French are darker skinned than the French back in the day who lived in middle France and upper northern France, whereas their skin tone was more white. So what he was seeing is he was seeing Southern French with darker skin, who were still French, but darker skin, move toward the central and northern parts of France, and he suggested that they stay where they belong, that they stay where they live, and that they stay around the people who look like them. Because the more northern they got, the less they looked like northern French citizens. That's when he made basically the discrepancy between even inter-country races of people. But of course, he was basing it solely off of skin color. Yes, they were French. Yes, they spoke the same language. They were born in the same country. But geographically, they lived in separate spots within their own country. And he was again making the suggestion that they stay where they are and that they live among their own, whereas middle geographic French continue to exist where they exist, and then northern French continue to exist where they exist and reproduce among their own. So that's where the origin of the term race comes from. And the discrepancy between, again, that word, of course, being created rather out of thin air, but being created, used, and then ultimately weaponized much later among individuals like Leon Trotsky to basically say that if you don't like another race, then you're racist. See the slippery slope there as to how quickly that can be weaponized and be used against someone. And then, of course, that person is demonized, and then you throw it into the media or the workplace, or you cast them out as being a racist. And if the majority yells it, well, then it must be true. This is where this word manipulation exists, and it becomes weaponized. So again, the term race was actually accredited with a French nationalist, an aristocrat, an entrepreneur, and I believe he was an economist as well, Georges Louis Leclerc, 100 years before Darwin. The next word, this is a big one, anti-Semitic. The term anti-Semitic is completely made up. It implies that you are anti-Shem, implying that all Jews are descendants of Shem. This is not true. So you are anti-Shem's bloodline, is where the term anti-Semitic ultimately originates from. Now, who coined the term anti-Semitic and when? This matters, and this is a big deal. As I said at the top, you always have to take into consideration the person, the time, what was going on at the time, and then the motive behind creating the word and then the definition. First of all, anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism doesn't even exist, just like racism doesn't exist. These are made-up terms out of thin air for the purposes of protecting one person, individual, and or group or religion over another. The term anti-Semitic was coined by a liberal communist Jew by the name of Moritz Steinschneider. This is a fact. It was coined in the late 1800s by the Austrian Jewish scholar Moritz Steinschneider to describe racist views, see there's that word, about Semitic peoples. This was then narrowed by others into meaning bigotry toward Jews. It replaced the more colloquial term of anti-Jewish racism or Judenhass, or Jew hatred, quote unquote. At that time, anti-Semitism had become a coherent political movement that succeeded in founding political parties and winning local elections. Sound familiar? You see, it's still a strategy that's used today. Call people anti-Semitic, tell people that if they don't denounce anti-Semitism, then there's something wrong with them, and then they lose their job, their political position, etc., etc. It was created by a communist Jew who was in the print media to be weaponized against anybody who disagreed with them for the purposes of ostracizing them and all the other weaponization reasons that they use it. The term was later then perpetuated in the 1800s and early 1900s by Wilhelm Marr, who was Mortz's protege, and also in the print media, and a communist, and by that time a Marxist also, and Jewish. You see why they don't teach this in school? Do you see why even if you attempted to teach this in school, you would lose your job? Regardless of the subject. If you were a history major, a reading major, a reading or history educator, language arts educator / major, no chance. You're not going to learn about this in college, and you're not going to be able to teach it in a K-12 school or at the university level. They don't want people to know the who, what, where, when, why, and how of words. So, pop quiz, true, false. Does anti-Semitism exist? The answer is no. There's no such thing. There are people who don't like Jews because they do things that Jews do, which is communism, because they created communism. It's the behaviors and the ideologies that they don't like. I've met lots of nice Jewish people who don't practice Judaism. They are of Jewish bloodline, but they do not practice Judaism, nor do they act like your stereotypical Jew, so to speak. And stereotypes, of course, are embedded in all of this because that's where they come from. They come from a set of behaviors that are attributed to either religions or races of people. But if you criticize those in any way, even though you're criticizing the behavior or the group, this is where these words get used against a person to be falsely attributed to a person, to be weaponized against said person. The next term is sexist. Again, this is incorrectly coined by radical feminist Jew Margaret Feldman. As it turns out, she was not the one who created this. So there's quite the history with this term. Allow me to read this. The term sexist, an adjective, 1965, from the noun sex, on model of racist, coined by Pauline M. Leet, Director of Social Programs at Franklin and Marshall College, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, United States, in a speech which circulated in mimeograph among feminists. Don't worry, I'll get into that word next. It was popularized by the use in print by Carolyn Bird's introduction to Born Female, quote unquote, in 1968. Which also introduced the term sexism. The concept and the development of the concept of sexism was influenced by various key figures and theorists. One prominent figure was Simone de Beauvoir, a French existentialist, philosopher, and feminist writer, whose book, The Second Sex, published in 1949, critically examined the social and cultural construction of gender and the ways in which women were oppressed in patriarchal societies. Her work laid the foundation for understanding the systemic nature of sexism. Now let me stop there for a minute. That right there also is a perfect foundation and building ground for these fake words, is you take some oppression that exists among the perceived some, and then you build a word on it, and then a definition, and then that word and definition defines the behavior. So, for example, if you're a female who's being abused in a marriage, a feminist, quote unquote, would tell you that your husband is sexist and that they don't like you because you are a woman, even though that's what the word misogyny means. But even so, they would say that your husband is discriminating against you, or society or government is discriminating against an entire sex of people because they are looked down upon in a particular role. That they can maintain the home, but they can't vote. That they can raise children, but they can't work. And this is, again, is where the victimization comes in, because you need the fairy tale of victimization to tell people that this happens on a majority level, when in fact it does not. And then a person drinks it in and believes it, and then they self-identify with these words. That they're the victim of sexism. That they've had sexist individuals discriminate against them. And therefore they now are a feminist because XYZ. You need all of the psychological manipulation in order for something like this to take root. It goes on here. It says, quote, another influential figure was Betty Friedan, an American feminist and author of the Feminine Mystique, quote unquote, published in 1963. Friedan's book challenged the traditional gender roles assigned to women and sparked a national conversation about the limitations placed on women's lives and aspirations. Her work played a pivotal role in raising awareness about the psychological and social consequences of sexism. Of course, this is all a giant lie, and it became a profitable movement among communists. And that was created by whom again? The Jewish lobby. Because they saw a profit in it. We can tell women that they're the victim. We can tell women that they can work as hard as men. We can tell women you'll be just as happy as a man in a working role without a family. And then they'll believe it. We'll feed them articles, pictures, movies, TV shows, etc., etc., etc. And we'll normalize it in society. And then the woman will end up single, alone, unmarried, working to keep a roof over her head and food in her mouth. They will end up childless, alone, barren, and then dead. It's social engineering. It's the creation of fake words and then fake definitions and then fake victimhood across the board, as if everybody's been victimized in the same way, which they have not. To then normalize that behavior, normalize it in groups of people, create political movements based on it, and then ultimately steal lives from people by convincing them that wherever they are and whatever they're doing without men in their lives and without children in their lives is the way that they should live their life. It's remarkably depressing. And unfortunately, it is a fact of life. Not to mention, as I said earlier, if I didn't say it earlier, they're taxed, thereby increasing the taxable revenue for the Jewish lobby, the bankers, the people who run corporations, etc., by increasing the workforce. That leads me to the next term, feminism. This was first coined as feminine in the mid-14th century. It wasn't a bad word at all, but around the 1920s and mid to late 1960s, it became more prominent and changed its usage to turn into a political movement, i.e., social engineering experiment, to drive women into the workforce and away from the home, thereby making them single, more likely to be divorced, never marry, nor have children, all while taxing them and increasing their chances of financial debt. Consistently ask yourself who's creating these words. Why are they creating these words? Why are they creating these definitions? And then normalizing the behavior among influential people so that the unwitting person watches, listens, and hears about all of this and sees it and then blindly accepts it. This is what destroys nations. And historically speaking, who are nation destroyers? As it turns out, they happen to be Jewish. It happens to be the Khazarian Mafia and Satan. And they're all one and the same. No, I'm not talking about the nice Jewish lady who wears a cross around her neck down the street. It's not who I'm talking about. Not talking about someone of Jewish bloodline who's kind and friendly and loves Christians and Jesus Christ. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the individuals who want everyone else to not exist except for them. That's the issue here. They also, by the way, this has to be mentioned from a historic standpoint, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, they changed the definitions of words in 2020 in the English dictionary. They changed the term of the word vaccine to include mRNA. That wasn't a timing accident. That was a very, very deliberate on purpose. So who funds the Oxford English Dictionary? Who funds Webster's Dictionary, even? I think you know. Here's the next term. Ready for this one? It's one you've heard a lot. The derogatory term, and it is a derogatory term and a combination of a number of different words, but the term Nazi. This was coined originally, or so it's thought, by a Jewish Marxist who was also in the print media and a communist, because they all go hand in hand, by the name of Conrad Hayden. The term Nazi is a derogatory term. It literally means National Socialist Ignatz. It's short for Ignatz. That if you ascribed to or were a supporter of the National Socialist DAP party of the 1930s, then you were a Nazi, quote unquote. So Conrad Hayden, a German-American journalist and author, Jewish, popularized the term Nazi in English-speaking countries throughout his book, Adolf Hitler, the Dictator, quote unquote. Although he did not invent the word, it says, Hayden extensively used it to refer to the National Socialist movement, contributing to its wider recognition. Yes, because again, if you're in the print media and you're being paid to advance a narrative, then you can get away with word manipulation, can't you? Because that's what the media does consistently. Just like with the term democracy, same thing. So the term Nazi means National Socialist Ignatz. It's like calling someone retarded. So let me ask you this. Do you actually believe that the country of Germany and the people within and the political party within that won a legal election with Adolf Hitler at the helm, do you believe that they called themselves retarded? Or Ignatz? Do you believe, or ignorant? Do you believe that they called themselves, geographically speaking, Nazi Germany? No, of course not. We don't call ourselves retarded Americans. They didn't call themselves ignorant Germans. So when you hear the term Nazi Germany, understand there is no such thing. There's just Germany. And there are no Nazis. They don't exist. They didn't call themselves that. They were the German people. That's it. But they were victimized by the print media. Heavily victimized by the print media, which of course invaded them and pushed them into war. And if you don't believe me, you need to watch the documentary, Europa: The Last Battle. It's free online to watch. 9 parts, 12 hours long. Very worth it. Also available on Blu-ray and DVD at moneytreepublishing.com. I highly recommend it. So I've never used the term Nazi, and when you hear people say that someone is a Nazi, understand that that they themselves are using a term that was created and perpetuated, rather, by a communist Jew in the print media, and that it is a derogatory term. Here's the next term, which you've heard a lot also. The term fascist. It says, quote, Mussolini coined the term fascism in 1919. The word comes from the Italian fasciso, meaning, or fasciso, if I'm saying that right, meaning a bundle or a group. And it is considered a term for a militant brotherhood. The word fasces, or fasces, rather, means an axe tightly bound with sticks, an image that became a symbol for the fascist movement. Now, a fasces is fascinating, no pun intended there, because you can actually see this particular symbol on both sides of the dais in the House of Representatives in Congress in the United States of America in Washington, D.C. It is a bundle of sticks with an axe tightly bound around it. Or an axe, rather, with the sticks that are tightly bound around the actual axe. Now, here's what it actually means, and it's not bad. It's not an evil word. Fascism was created as a political movement to be the exact opposite of communists, Marxists, and Bolsheviks, specifically Bolshevism, which was a violent revolution put together by communist Jews against freedom-loving individuals and nationalists. And the term nationalism means love of one's country. Now, why is that a bad thing? Why is nationalism a bad thing? To love where you live and love your country and love your homeland. That's why the fascist movement from Italy gained steam and popularity, because Italians wanted to be Italians. They were interested in being Italians. They didn't want to be communists. They didn't want to be Bolsheviks. They fought them in World War II against them in Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was called at the time. That was the point. Adolf Hitler fought the exact same enemy. That was the point. That's because the German people were nationalists. They had love of country, their country. And when they moved from country to country, what were they doing? They were liberating those countries from communism. So when you hear politicians today or media pundits all say the terms fascist, communist, Marxist, racist, blah, 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 and they lump all of them together as if they're all the same, they're not. They're not. Fascism steps aside and stands alone, away from those others, and against those others, rather. That's why, again, the term fascism was created. It says in modern interpretations and in more recent times, the term fascism has been used to describe political movements and ideologies that exhibit authoritarian tendencies, such as xenophobia or a fear of others that are not of your race and of your geographic origin, and the suppression of civil liberties. It is often used in debates and discussions to highlight potential dangers and warn against the erosion of democratic values. Did you catch that? So when someone says Donald Trump's a fascist and that he's trying to destroy our democratic values, well, based on the origins of those two words, the answer is yes, and that's not a bad thing. Now, I don't know if Donald Trump knows the origins of these words or not. There's no way that I would know that. But what I've heard him say is I've heard him lump all of these terms together as if they're the same thing. We're going to get rid of the fascists, the communists, the Marxists, the this, the that, and the other. Fascism stands alone. It stands alone as its own political movement, meaning oneness. Oneness in brotherhood for country, to fight against the enemy of freedom, the enemy of individual liberty, the enemy of nationalism, the enemy of country. That's not a bad thing. So again, when you see the two images of the bundle of sticks tightly wrapped around an axe on both sides of the dais in Congress, the fasces, understand that that's actually its origin. It means a together, a oneness against communism is what it's supposed to mean. And it's ancient. It dates back to Rome, if I'm not mistaken, also. But again, because it's Latin and Greek and of that original origin, but was popularized by Benito Mussolini. So it's not a bad thing. The next term is Marxism. It says, quote, Friedrich Engels developed historical materialism together with Karl Marx. Marxism, as a doctrine, was born in the 19th century as a result of the popularization of the ideas of Marx and Engels. These were inspired by the different previous socialist currents known from then on as utopian socialism, since Engels coined the term scientific socialism for the Marxist perspective. Something important to keep in mind is that Marx did not invent socialism, which preceded him, but endowed it with his own philosophical and anthropological perspective. Ultimately, Karl Marx, using the term Marxism later on and those using it in reference to him, was a combination of communism, socialism, and then his own twists on human behavior and how to use humans to ultimately carry out the goals that they wanted to accomplish from a psychological or a economical standpoint, and ultimately an ideological standpoint. This, of course, is one of the places where the term useful idiot comes into play, which was also popularized by Vladimir Lenin. That you use the unwitting supporters of yourself to your advantage without them looking into anything, and then ultimately you use them to accomplish your goals, which ultimately are, in the case of Marxism, the utter destruction of everything, so that you end up with nothing, that you will own nothing and be happy. Where have you heard that before? Klaus Schwab. But everybody says Klaus Schwab's German. He has a German accent, so he's like Adolf Hitler. No, he's related to the Rothschilds, who are Jewish. And Klaus Schwab is a Marxist. And he's a communist. And a Bolshevik. He's the opposite of everything that Adolf Hitler was. They're not the same. Here's the next term, communism. 1841, as both a noun and adjective from French communiste, from commune, Old French commune, common, or general, or free, or open, or public. First attested in writing by John Goodwin Barmby, 1820 to 1881, British Oneite and utopian socialist who founded the London Communist Propaganda Society in 1841. Main modern sense, quote, an opponent of capitalism or supporter of revolutionary leftism, unquote. Emerged after publication of Communist Manifesto in 1848, written, of course, by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. So communism was given new life and new birth as a result of the Communist Manifesto. But the ideology dates back to the Talmud. This is where, again, communism originates. A freeness, a openness, a commune, a common mentality among all. And then, of course, consequences for the people who don't go along with the quote-unquote democracy or the commune of the group. It says, as the name of a political or economic theory which rests upon the abolition of the right of private property, especially the means of production and distribution, and seeks to overthrow capitalism by revolution, unquote. This, of course, is where you get the Bolshevik Revolution, which I'll bring up in a little bit. And those individuals refer to themselves as Bolsheviks. All Jewish, all communist, all Marxist. And there's a big difference, by the way, between National Socialist, commonly referred to in 1930s Germany, and Russian or Soviet Union Marxist Socialist. They're polar opposites. In National Socialism, you have individuals working for themselves, but for the collective of the betterment of their country and the people who work within, regardless of who those people are. Not so with Soviet Union Marxist socialism. That's different. That is a means of control of all of the people, including via murder of their own people who disagree, for ultimate control over not just one's country, but every country. So look at the similarities that exist now across the entire world from country to country. What do you see? You see more Soviet socialism and Marxist and communistic socialism than you do nationalism and a love of one's country. That brings us to the term socialism. It says, quote, the term socialism comes from the Latin verb socrere, if I'm saying that right, which means to combine or share something. The first attested use of this term was registered in 1827 in the UK magazine, the Co-operative Magazine. In the 30s and the 19th century, the followers of Robert Owen in the UK and Saint Simon in France, or Saint Simon perhaps in France, began to call their views socialism, quote-unquote. In the 40s of the 19th century, the term became very popular in many industrialized countries, especially in France, Belgium, and Germany. The socialists derived their intellectual heritage from Republic by Plato and from Utopia by Thomas More. However, as in the case of liberalism and conservatism, socialism origins date back to the 19th century. So socialism at its origin derives its intellectual heritage from Plato's Republic that was written based on Socrates. Not a bad thing. But the socialism that existed back then was not what we see now. See, the term socialism today is ubiquitous with communism. They didn't used to exist. They didn't used to be the same thing. They were polar opposites, but now they're the same thing. This is where, again, the hijacking of these words and their origins and who created them and why they created them has been perversed over the course of time. This is where it leads right into Bolshevism. Here we go. It says, quote, since 1945, the Bolshevik model of communism was imposed on the countries of Eastern Europe, also adopted in China, North Korea, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Now again, the Bolshevistic model of communism, which is the violent wing of communism. So who created communism? Jews did. And who created Bolshevism? Jews did. So when someone says, who created communism? And the standard left or right wing or alternative media answer is China, that's wrong. That's 100% false. It was the Jewish Bolsheviks and the Jewish communists who created both of those. They were the ones who taught Asian countries about communism. They introduced it to them. And then they, of course, carried it out in their own countries. And what did that lead to? It led to war. Because it's designed to lead to war, because that's what Bolshevism is. It says at the end of the 20th century, socialism suffered some spectacular failures, which led some to declare the death of socialism, quote unquote. The most dramatic failure was the collapse of communism as a result of the revolution in Eastern Europe in 1989 through 1991. Now, there's more to that history than I can get into on this episode, but this right here again should prove to people that there's always more going on behind the scenes, and that these revolutions can take a peaceful, how would I call it? They can wear what is perceived to be a peaceful mask to get rid of communism, only to usher in a softer form of communism that is perceived by the people to be more peaceful, when in fact it is not. That's why you now have in Europe, in all of Europe, the European Union. That's communism. Even if you think you're a French citizen living in France with a French president, you also have a prime minister, and then, of course, the head of the European Union, which rules over France. So you have 3 rulers now as a citizen inside a country in Europe. It's the opposite of what Adolf Hitler wanted. He wanted the French to have their own French independent government. The Italians, the same thing. Germans, same thing. Austrians, same thing. Swiss, same thing. Not the case now. That leads us then to the Bolsheviks, derived from Bolshevinisto, or meaning majority, were a fraction of the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, which split apart from the Menshevik, if I'm saying that right, fraction, at the Second Party Congress in 1903, and ultimately became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks seized power in Russia during the October Revolution phase of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and founded the Soviet Union, of course killing Tsar Nicholas II, murdering his entire family, torturing them, engaging in blood libel. And who did that to them? That's right, communist Jews, because they were the ones who created Bolshevism. That leads me to the term humanism. Humanism is an odd one. Its origins were not bad, but then became perverse, not all of these words, but a great deal of them. And then, of course, it turned into something that essentially means godlessness, and that you as an individual can become a god. It says the following, quote, humanatis meant the development of human virtue in all its forms, to its fullest extent. Doesn't sound bad, because it, again, wasn't initially. It says the term thus implied not only such qualities are associated with the modern word humanity, or understanding, benevolence, compassion, mercy, but also much more assertive characteristics as fortitude, judgment, prudence, eloquence, and even love of honor. Does that sound terrible? It shouldn't. It says, consequently, the possessor of humanatis could not be merely a sedentary and isolated philosopher or man of letters, but was of necessity, a participant in active life. Just as action without insight was held to be aimless and barbaric, insight without action was rejected as barren and imperfect. Humanitas called for a fine balance of action and contemplation, a balance born not of compromise, but of complementarity. The modern founding of humanism was developed by poet and scholar Francisco Petrarca in the 14th century, who is believed to be the modern founder of the philosophy. While it was founded as a secular movement, Petrarca was very devout to Catholicism. After his death, humanism at the time, as Renaissance humanism, quote unquote, or traditional humanism, quote unquote, was defined as a broad cultural movement reviving a set of classical texts and ideologies from the Roman and Greek times. It spread across all of Italy and latter the rest of Europe, originating from Tuscany. Humanists believe in the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. They emphasize the importance of treating people with respect, valuing their autonomy, and recognizing the unique qualities that make each person valuable. Unquote. Again, that doesn't sound like a bad thing because it isn't, because at its inception, it wasn't. The problem is that in the latter half of the 1800s and early 1900s, you ended up having these philosophers who would sit around and think about being godless, which many of them were. They were not Christians. They became atheists, and then they perverted the term humanism to become that you as a human in all its forms can be God. So if you think of the modern term of the term humanist now, based on the philosophies, many of which unfortunately were educational philosophers like John Dewey, who were atheists and believed that they could accomplish godhood or a godlike state. If you believe that, well, then that's clearly a perverse angle of the definition, but it didn't start off that way. Humanism had to do with, again, being God-centered and understanding that you'll never reach your full potential if you don't understand that your potential is limitless as a human being. But not limitless, rather, to the point where you actually feel like you are a god. That's, of course, impossible. There is only one God, and that's the way that it is. So a human being cannot become a god. But unfortunately, among the atheists, when they got a hold of the term humanism, they changed it. So there's that one. Then there's this, the term Zionism. You'll hear this one with regularity in modern times also. Here's the history of this. It says, quote, Zionism is a satanic movement founded by Theodor Herzl in 1896, whose goal is the return of Jews to Eretz Israel, or Zion, the Jewish synonym for Jerusalem and the land of Israel. The name of Zionism, quote unquote, comes from the hill Mount Zion, the hill on which the Temple of Jerusalem was situated. It says the truth is that every Jew is a Zionist. Those Jews that claim they are not Zionists must also claim that they are not Jews. You cannot separate a Jew from Zionism, just like you cannot separate a Greek from being Hellenic. DNA tests prove Jews' genetic mix of many different nationalities ever since they migrated from their homeland of Khazaria or Turkey in 800 BC. Unfortunately, the truth is that Zionism started way back in the Roman Catholic Church days when the Khazarians or Satanic Jews infiltrated Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. Unquote. So again, when you hear the term Zionism or are you a Zionist, if a person is Jewish, then they are a Zionist. If a person is not Jewish, of Jewish bloodline, and they say that they are a Zionist, for example, Joe Biden, who is openly on the record in interviews, on tape, and audio saying that he's a Zionist, then that means that he again is a proponent of that land to be owned by Jews in any definition of the word, and any manipulation and future manipulation of the word and its geographic origin. Now, what's interesting about history's manipulation regarding all of this, as you might expect, is that this is exactly what Adolf Hitler was even attempting to do and agreed to do, was to take the 98% of the communists who existed in Europe. 98% of all communists in Europe happened to be Jewish. So he gave them an out. He said, we will move you to Jerusalem. We will move you to northern Palestine. And we will move you to this area that you believe to be your land. So here you go. We'll give you an out this way geographically. We'll fly you there. We'll take you by train, etc., etc. That was the idea. You would think, again, that being Zionists, that's what they would want. As it turned out, from a historic standpoint, many individuals who were German Jews wanted to remain in Germany because they liked Germany. They didn't disagree with Adolf Hitler per se. They just wanted to continue to live there. But they had no homes to go back to because the British Army destroyed them. The German Army didn't destroy their own land. That's not why everybody was homeless in Germany after X amount of time. That's not why they were moved into work camps. They were moved into work camps because they had to produce for their own country, because they had nowhere else to go. It was actually the German army taking care of them, believe it or not. That, of course, isn't what the Jewish-owned media would lead anybody to believe, and certainly not the Hollywood movies, and of course, who produces and funds all of those. You should figure that out, but even so, that right there is part of it. They were actually attempting to give them the thing that they claimed they wanted. And some of them took them up on that offer, and some did not. But as it turned out, even when Adolf Hitler moved them into the Middle East, so to speak, he didn't care what happened to them once they got there. He said, well, if this is your home, even though it's someone else's, if you go there, what those other people do to you is their business. And that's your business, but it's no longer ours because you're not in our country anymore. So again, when someone says that they're a Zionist, understand that they are saying that they are Israel first, because that's what that means. And when someone says, politicians, for example, say that Israel is our greatest ally, they are not. They are not. Not from a historic standpoint, and they never have been. And there are a million reasons why that's the case. Certainly from an ideological and Christian-based standpoint, they are not. And there's no such thing as Judeo-Christianity. They are not the same. They are not on the same wavelength. I've been over all of that before on the show, too. And I could go, again, off into numerous directions here, but there you have it. I'm just trying to stay as focused as I can here. It's getting late, and there you have it. 2 more words, and then we're done. I promise. The next one is the term Holocaust. This is Greek for burnt offering. This does not mean that Jews themselves burn themselves to offer themselves to God or their God. That's not what it means. The term Holocaust literally means that Jews will burn others for their offering to their God, which, as it turns out, is Moloch, or a form of Satan. So the real burnt offering, or Holocaust, quote unquote, from World War II was Dresden. And all of the individuals who died during that time for that war, all of that was the burnt offering to their God of innocent lives, regardless of what perceived side they were on. Because what does Satan want? He wants blood. And that's what they were giving him. Now there's this piece of audio I want to play. and this was an individual going through historic newspapers long before World War II, where Jews in the print media were specifically bringing up the number of 6 million. This happened way before their definition of some perceived Holocaust. Keep in mind, the term Holocaust does not mean that people are killing Jews. It means that Jews are killing other people for their God as a blood libel. So give this a listen in 3, 2, 1.
Where these Jews are pushing this 6 million figure between the years of 1915 and 1938. The first newspaper is The Sun of New York. New York, June the 6th, 1915. Since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish people have had no darker page in their history than that which the Russian government is writing today. 6 million Jews. Dear brethren, have mercy on the 6 million Jews in Russia. October the 18th, 1918. $1 billion fund to rebuild Jewry. There it is. 6 million souls will need help to resume normal life when war is ended. 6 million Jews need help. September the 8th, 1919. Mass meeting hears that 127,000 Jews have been killed and 6 million are in peril. 6 million. This fact that the population of 6 million souls in Ukraine and in Poland have received notice through action and by word that they are going to be completely exterminated. You literally cannot make this up. November the 12th, 1919. About 6 million souls, or half the Jewish population of the earth. 6 million. 6 million souls. February 23rd, 1920. He called upon the Atlanta Jews to arise to the occasion and to contribute to the emergency fund in order that the lives of 6 millions of Jewish people may be saved. 6 millions. He drew a graphic picture of the starvation and suffering of the 6 million Jews who live in Eastern Europe and Palestine. 6 million Jews. Friday, May the 7th, 1920. The Fund for Jewish War Sufferers in Central and Eastern Europe, where 6 millions face horrifying conditions of famine, disease and death. July the 20th, 1921. Begs America, save 6 million in Russia. Russia's 6 million Jews are facing extermination by massacre. This is 1921, 12 years before Adolf Hitler ever set foot in the government. Look at that. December the 29th, 1931. 6 million Jews face starvation. 6 million. 6 million Jews in Eastern Europe face starvation, and even worse during the coming winter. Sunday, May the 31st, 1936. This does not say the 6 million Jews, but it does say Holocaust of the millions of Jews in the European Holocaust. The European Holocaust in 1936, before the Second World War even started. Great Britain has it within her power to throw open the gates of Palestine and let in the victimized and persecuted Jews escaping from the European Holocaust. The European Holocaust in 1936, 3.5 years before the Second World War ever even started. February the 23rd, 1938. This is before the Second World War started. A Jewish tragedy pictured. A depressing picture of 6 million Jews in Central Europe deprived of protection or economical opportunities, slowly dying of starvation. All hope gone, was presented to the teachers by Jacob Tarsus. The Jewish tragedy started when Hitler came into power in 1933. There it is again, people. 6 million Jews in Central Europe, slowly dying of starvation. 6 million. This is in 1938. Jewish teachers chided by Isaacs. New York Times, February 23rd, 1938, a year and a half before the Second World War even started.
Again, the lesson here is that if you're in control of the print media and you're paid to be a user of words and sentences and social engineering, then you can do that almost without favor or thought, or certainly with favor toward whatever it is that you want to favor in any direction where you want to manipulate people. And this has been going on dating back to the very moment where somebody stuck a little message inside of a little container attached to a crow's leg, and then they threw the crow in the air, and then off they flew, and inside that message was some kind of a lie to then be picked up by the recipient and read and falsely believed, all the way to the modern day today, regardless of the form of communication. This leads me to the last word, just kind of for fun, although it's a term that lots of people have heard, and this right here, no pun intended, is exactly how perverse this word has been manipulated also throughout the course of history. In fact, the history of this word rather, is rather lengthy, but I will end with this. The term homophobia, it says the following. The Oxford English Dictionary provides 2 entries for the word homophobia. The first of these can be traced back to 1901 and is marked as rare by the editors. In 1901, the Des Moines Daily News in Iowa included an article which stated, quote, "Young women of America have homophobia, just as children have measles," unquote. By this, the author did not mean that young American women have an irrational hatred of gay people. Instead, this homophobia, the earliest use of the word on record, is an irregular formation based on the ancient Greek suffix phobia, denoting an irrational fear or hatred, and the Latin homo, meaning man, as in Homo sapiens, which literally means wise man. So the author of the article meant that young American women have a fear of men, or of the male sex. That's the origin of the word. See how perverse it's become now? It's amazing. In 1920, it says, Chambers' Journal of Popular Literature also used the word once again with the meaning of hatred of men or the male sex, quote unquote. Her salient characteristic was a contempt for the male sex as represented in the human biped. It says the seeds of homophobia had been sown early, unquote. As previously noted, one of the striking things about this initial attempt to get the word homophobia into wider use is that its etymology combines Greek and Latin elements. Such formations are relatively rare and are often scorned by purists and classicists because they combine classical Greek and Latin elements. But if we're going to throw out such words, we must also shun television, bigamy, genocide, petroleum, and automobile, all of which are similarly formed from a combination of Greek and Latin. Curiously enough, the word homosexual is another word which initially anointed the etymological purists, being half Greek and half Latin. Homo is from the Greek for same, while sexual is Latin. And that brings us to the larger coinage, or recoinage of homophobia. In 1969, the American magazine Screw, which specializes in what we might euphemistically describe as gentlemen's special interest, titillation aimed at homosexual men, included an article which used the word homophobia. But although the word was used this time in reference to homosexuality, so homo as in the Greek for same, as in same sex, rather than homo as in Latin for man, as it had been used in the 1901 Des Moines Daily News article, the word still didn't carry its modern meaning. Here instead, the word homophobia was used to refer to as a fear of being thought homosexual oneself. As the author of the article explained, glossing a word which they must have realized would be new and unfamiliar to their readers. Homophobia is, quote, an intense and neurotic fear of being thought attracted to one's own sex. The Oxford English Dictionary also marks this sense of the word as rare, quote unquote. The Screw article appeared in May 1969. Instead, they have to wait until October of 1969 to find the first truly modern use of the word to mean hostility towards homosexual people or to homosexuality in general. The suffix phobia, which in the Screw article more clearly relates to a fear or neuroses, has come to mean hostility or hatred by the time the word appeared in Time magazine on the 31st of October 1969, where it said, quote, such homophobia ... involves innumerable misconceptions and oversimplifications. The gay liberation movement in the United States in the late 1960s had helped to put the word homophobia into general circulation, and people such as George Weinberg, Jewish, would popularize it further in the 1970s as awareness of gay rights issues spread in the U.S. and elsewhere. The adjective homophobic and the noun homophobe followed in 1971, and now the word is widely used and understood. But its curious origins reveal several attempts to get the word in print over half a century before with a quite different meaning, all based on the different meaning of homo in Greek and Latin, unquote. You can see how deep the deception goes. I hope you can see how far back these words and made-up words and real words and combinations of words actually go, and how they become perverse and misused and weaponized over time. Please understand that the people who use these words know not what they're saying. They're foolish, and they're acting like they are. I'm going to leave it at that. That's a general history of those words, certainly based on their origins, their dates, their times, who created them out of thin air, how some of them were not only created, but ultimately, of course, weaponized against people for political movements and political persuasions, and ultimately to control the masses. Don't be fooled by them. And the easiest way to not be fooled by them is twofold. Don't use them, and then, when someone uses them, call them out for using them. Because if you were to question them as to what they mean, they would have no idea. And then you have them right where you want them, with facts, as opposed to the lies that they've believed their whole lives. Thank you for listening as always. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.
Thank you for listening to American Education FM. Make sure and check out AmericanEducationFM.com for more information. Take care and God bless.